The humble North American beaver, with its stout body, large head, and hand-like front feet, is often considered rather cute, but an unlikely villain in a rail disaster. But when a train and its crew embarked on a routine journey on one of Canada's most remote railway lines, no one knew that a cost-cutting measure taken a year earlier, with help from the local beaver population, would lead to an unfortunate accident. What should have been a regular day at work for the train's crew would ultimately cost one their life and leave the other with a lifelong trauma. At around 12 PM on the 15th of September 2018, train number 995, a mixed freight service operated by Hudson Bay Railway, departed the small Canadian town of The Pas en route to Thompson via the Wekusko subdivision. With a total length of around 1,600 feet and a combined weight of more than 3,000 tons, the train consisted of 3 locomotives and 27 wagons, including 8 tank cars filled with gasoline and LPG. In the lead locomotive were the train's only 2 occupants, the 59-year-old locomotive engineer, whose name was never released, and the 38-year-old conductor, Kevin Anderson. Both were qualified for their respective positions and familiar with the territory. The journey from The Pas to Thompson was around 190 miles or 305 kilometers and would take at least 10 hours. The line was part of an 810-mile stretch of track operated by the Hudson Bay Railway, a short-line railroad company. With an operation spanning from The Pas to Churchill on the shores of Hudson Bay, the line traversed some of Canada's most remote regions, and much was reachable only by air or rail, and cell phone coverage was limited. In fact, the area was so remote that train number 995 was only one of 6 trains to use the Wekusko subdivision each week. Due to the low-density nature of the Wekusko subdivision, there are no trackside signals. Instead, crews communicate by radio with train control, who issue them clearances. With an average of less than 1 train per day, drivers often got clearance for the entire journey. Train number 995 was issued track clearance from its starting point at The Pas right through to Wabaldon, more than 120 miles or 200 kilometers away. Once at Wabaldon, they were scheduled to cross a southbound passenger train. Like many areas of the Canadian rail network, portions of the Hudson Bay Railway were built on raised sections of sandfill that passed over small bodies of water. However, when exposed to unusual water events caused by high rainfall, a breached beaver dam, rapid snowmelt, or a blocked culvert, the soil stability can be impacted, leading to a washout. In fact, there were 23 washouts caused by flooding across the Hudson Bay Railway in the previous 12 months. The Matisto River crossing near Ponton, approximately 140 miles southwest of Thompson, was an area of distinct vulnerability. Traversing the creek previously had been a trestled rail bridge, but for whatever reason, a raised sandbank replaced the bridge with 2 boxed culverts for drainage. This created a susceptibility to a washout in high water levels. To mitigate the issue, the area was subject to regular inspections and monitoring, and the crossing had been inspected just 2 days prior. Although high water levels were noted in the inspection on September 13th, the records show the culverts were flowing adequately. However, a little further upstream, a disaster was brewing, but from the most unlikely culprits. At around 2:45 PM, the crew of train 995, upon passing the Dice siding at milepost 61.9, provided their final location report to train control. Although they could give further location reports, it was not required nor standard practice. This meant that, for the next 3.5 hours until reaching Wabaldon and crossing the southbound passenger train, no one expected to hear from them, nor would they likely be contacted. The humble North American beaver makes its home in a number of freshwater habitats such as rivers, streams, lakes and ponds, and while they may be rather cute, they represent a somewhat unique danger to rail safety. Large beaver dams can slow down water flow, and just like an artificial dam, they trap large quantities of water on the upper side. However, if the beaver dam is breached, it can result in a sudden and significant torrent of water to flow downstream. And while the Hudson Bay Railway did actively monitor the activity of beavers in the area, and in some cases actively removed their dams to prevent uneven pooling of water, the program had been scaled back in recent years. At around 4:30 PM, train number 995 was fast approaching the Matishto River crossing near Ponton. What the two-man crew were unaware of was that sometime after the crossing had been inspected 2 days earlier, several beaver dams had been breached, unleashing a torrent of water. As the water levels rose above the drainage culverts, the sand-filled banks supporting the tracks were eroded, resulting in a 50-foot gap that was 15 feet deep, leaving the rails intact but with no support beneath them. Observing the tracks still intact, the crew of train 995 did not immediately spot the washout, and therefore did not apply the emergency brake. The train continued onto the unsupported section of track, causing it to collapse, and the front locomotive smashed into the opposite bank of the washout. Due to the impact of the trailing vehicles, the lead locomotive had folded to a 45-degree angle at its midpoint, causing the generator and electrical cabinet to push forward into the cab and pin the crew. Both crew members had been seriously injured, with 38-year-old conductor Kevin Anderson the most severe and losing blood. But trapped in the cab, unable to reach their radios, they could not call for help, and worse, no one expected to hear from them for another 2 hours. The accident had occurred in one of the most remote areas of northern Manitoba, accessible only by air or rail, 148 miles northeast of the Pas and 97 miles southwest of Thompson. As the two-person train crew lay pinned inside their locomotive, unable to radio for help, and not expecting to be heard from, as luck would have it, a commercial helicopter carrying a crew of surveyors was flying over the area. Spotting a derailed train below, the chopper landed on a nearby sandbar to offer assistance. Realizing the severity of the crew's injuries and the inability to free them, the chopper radioed the Snow Lake Royal Canadian Mounted Police to report the derailment location and the current situation. At around 6:30 PM, 2 hours after the accident, the Thompson Fire and Emergency Services dispatched an ambulance with 2 paramedics from Thompson, more than an hour away, while the helicopter crew took off for nearby Ponton to pick up 2 members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and fly them back to the crash site. After landing back at the crash site, the chopper crew took off again and headed back to Ponton, where they would wait for the arrival of the paramedics dispatched from Thompson. However, as the train had been transporting gasoline and LPG, Thompson Fire and Emergency Services Management ordered its paramedics stay away from the accident site until its hazmat team had assessed the hazard. It was now past 7 PM, and while both members of the train crew were seriously injured, 38-year-old conductor Kevin Anderson, who was slowly bleeding, was now in very serious condition. And while 2 officers of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were on site with them, with the 2 men trapped, without the right equipment, there was little they could do to help. At around 9:45 PM, the Thompson Fire and Emergency Services hazmat team arrived at the staging area around 9 miles from the crash site. From there, access to the crash site was only possible by high rail vehicle. Darkness had fallen, and the chopper was no longer suitable. Somewhat amazingly, however, the high rail vehicle departed in the wrong direction, resulting in another 1-hour delay. It would not be until around 15 minutes to midnight that the Thompson Fire and Emergency Services hazmat team arrived on site. Observing no LPG had been spilled, paramedics were finally allowed to attend to the victims, almost 7 hours after the accident. However, attempts to extricate the crew proved difficult due to the lack of suitable equipment, so providing medical assistance proved difficult. At 12:53 am, almost 8 hours since the derailment, 38-year-old conductor Kevin Anderson, who had been slowly bleeding, finally succumbed to his injuries. At around 2:30 am, rescue workers finally freed the locomotive engineer. He was transported the 9 miles to the staging area by high-railer vehicle and then airlifted to Thompson General Hospital. Thankfully, he would eventually make a full recovery. The body of the conductor would not be recovered until 3 days later. The investigation into the accident revealed that the washout had occurred suddenly. Investigators also observed signs of beaver activity both upstream and to the east of the railway line. Moreover, several of their dams had been breached, resulting in a substantial release of water. It's worth noting that the Hudson Bay Railway had an extensive beaver control program until 2016. Employing a dedicated contractor, approximately 800 beaver dams were cleared each year in the vicinity of the Hudson Bay Railway. However, the program was discontinued in 2017 when the company took on the task internally. The new approach was on an as-needed basis and primarily only dams visible from the tracks. Consequently, the number of removed dams was reduced from 800 to just 100 annually. This would have certainly played a role in the accident. As strange as a beaver causing a train crash may sound, since 1992, the Canadian Transport Safety Board has investigated at least 4 other derailments involving a washout caused by a breached beaver dam, some of which resulted in crew fatalities or serious injuries. In April 2019, the Hudson Bay Railway reinstated its beaver control program. They also hired a specialist in bridges, structures, and culverts for all future inspections. They also updated their communications policy regarding remote territory, with crews now required to check in with train control at least once per hour.